morning, everyone. Welcome to the Fit for Food Policy Lab news desk, socially distanced, as you can see. So people will be trickling in at the moment. It's not quite 11:20 yet, but for everyone who's already with us, we're not going to be sharing a screen. This is the screen we're going to be sharing today. So in order to make sure that our video will remain the largest video during this session, please pin the video to your screen, and you can do that by moving your mouse over the video. And then at the top, you'll see the little dots. And when you click on there, you can select pin. And that should ensure that you keep seeing us, which for the purpose of this session would probably be a good thing.
Maybe we can also put it in the chat for people who are joining later.
Yeah. Good idea. We have 41 participants, so maybe give it like another minute. It's 11:20 right now.
We could already show the menu. People can go there.
Yes, we will be requiring some active participation from you today. So we're going to be asking some questions via Mentimeter. So if you are already here, please also open your browser and go to menti.com and type in the code that you see up here now. So that's 4484942. Just some preparatory work here. Not very hard yet. Next to the
first participant.
Yay! Great.
So it's nice to see where our audience is coming from.
Yeah,
while we're talking to a camera instead of a live audience.
Yeah, it's always nice to have a little bit of a feeling for who you have in the room with you. So yeah, sure. If you want to start filling in or responding to the first question, we'll make a nice word cloud and give you a bit of an idea as well who you're sharing the room with.
I see also a participant that's joining by phone from Kosovo, so they cannot enter. But
Kosovo, it's a nice one to keep in mind to add to the mix. Okay, great. I'm afraid in the interest of time, we have to get going. I'm sure people will continue to come in. So if we can go back to the opening slide. So yeah, welcome everybody. For those who've just joined, please pin our video because we'll be doing it in this way. We thought it would be a bit more fun and interactive like this, a bit less static. You can do that by moving your mouse over the video and clicking on the dots and then selecting pin. Vivian will also put that in the chat. So yes, today we're going to be telling you a little bit about the policy labs in Fit for Food, which we coordinated for the past 3 years already. I'm Chrissie Brierley. I'm the Deputy Coordinator of the JPI HDHL.
I'm Jolien Wenink. I'm the Coordinator of JPI at HDHL.
The role of R&I Policy Labs in boosting food system transformation. We have quite a bit of experience with this by now, and we wanted to tell you about that this can in fact be quite an effective instrument. We didn't do that completely by ourselves. Of course, the guiding of the policy labs. So here at the bottom, you see our partners mentioned, the Austrian Institute of Technology, Oslo Met, the VU University, and the JPI's Fatcha and Oceans. Next slide, please. So here just some meeting etiquette that you've also had for the other sessions. Of course, you can discuss what you're seeing here right now on Twitter by using these hashtags. And also, we are hoping to answer some questions at the end of the session. So please, when you have questions or comments during the session, put them in the chat. And at the end, you can also ask for the word, by just turning on your video and your mic or putting them in the chat. And then the next one. Yes, as we already said, we'd like to interact with you a little bit today. We want to know a few things of you. So please go to menti.com using this code. And then you'll come to our questions. What country are you from? Who do we have with us today? Some people from quite far. We have Brazil. Oh, Kosovo did get entered into the screen, which is nice. A lot of people from Spain, apparently.
Ireland, also pretty present.
Yeah. And this is nice. And as you keep going into the Mentimeter and filling this in, please, we do really encourage all of you to do it. Please keep the screen open next to the video. Maybe, Fairly, we can go to the next question. We seem to be having some issue. Yeah, there we go. What fields do you work in? We'd like to make another word cloud. So we have here policy, research, industry, funder, etc. What do you view yourself as? Please let us know. Ooh, that was a big up for research.
On one of the living labs is there.
Right. Okay, we have some funders with us.
Fellow funders. Chrissie and I also work for a funding agency.
Yeah, we work at JPI HDHL via ZonMw in the Netherlands, which is the Institute for Health Research here. Okay. Oh, we have some people from healthcare. That's good. So just as the food system is diverse, we do have a diverse group of people with us today, which is great. And then maybe the last one for now. What would you like to learn more about today? With which expectations have you come to this session? Maybe that's one you have to think about for a little bit, which is fine. I think we're already getting coming. Stakeholder engagement, well, you're definitely in the right place for that.
Useful outputs, we will touch on that for sure.
Definitely.
Lessons learned.
Okay, great. Maybe keep these coming. You can continue to fill in the Mentimeter, and we'll also come back to this later in the session. But for now, let's dive into this.
Yes. So for those of you who missed out on yesterday's keynote and are not familiar with Fit for Food, very brief. Fit for Food 2030 supports the Food 2030 policy framework and the view that our food systems face complex and persistent problems and that a transformation towards a healthy and sustainable food system is needed. Research and innovation can and should be a catalyst for this transformation, but R&I has its complex and persistent problems on its own, which limits the impact it currently has on the food system transformation. Next slide, please. So if we talk about research and innovation policy, it's important to realize that policy manifests on different levels, on the political, the executive, administrative, and technological level, and that one can intervene in all these different levels if you want to innovate and move towards change. And the best is, of course, to intervene in all these levels to get the best result. If you look to R&I policy around the world, there are three trends which have been set in the change of use of R&I policies. And the first one is that research agendas are anchored to the needs of society more and more. The second is the promotion of public and private collaboration to create a mechanism to link between economy, research, and higher education. And the third one is the system perspective to take into account in conducting research and drafting research programs. And according to the OECD, the latter, the system approach, has been proven a challenge for the government to embed in their R&I policies. It requires for the policymakers to understand the prerequisites and the context in which policy innovation are being implemented. And it also requires to know about the organization they fund in order to achieve effective funding mechanisms. Next slide, please. And as stressed before, the R&I system is dealing with multiple problems, which makes it difficult to impact on the societal challenges that they want to address and to conduct this system perspective. And this slide shows a couple of them. The R&I landscape is fragmented across disciplines and sectors. There is relatively a low private sector investment, especially in the European landscape around the food system. There's little support for inter and transdisciplinary research. And it's also often the case that the different programs that focus on different societal challenges, or the programs that focus on a societal challenge and on public-private partnerships, are not linked. and therefore there is no policy coherence or little policy coherence, and a lack of head-to-tail research programming. So in order to increase the impact of R&I, we need to innovate the R&I system. Next slide, please. And within Fit for Food 2030, we have built together a Food 2030 platform consisting of three components: the city labs at the local level, the policy labs at the regional and national level, and the EU think tank to link towards the EC and EU level. And all these actors and members of the platform work on strengthening the R&I policies, in building competences on the food system, R&I and RRI, and to raise awareness in support of initiatives and action plans. Next slide, please. So what is a policy lab for transformative change? This is something that already exists and that we didn't draft within in the project. Policy labs usually are used to tackle complex public or societal problems which traditional government structures or instruments do not manage to solve. And they are set up as a participatory and experimental stage in which stakeholders collaborate to develop and test novel policy approaches and instruments. They should have a direction to public policy, and those policy labs that work towards transformative change often have the need of a long-term commitment. They are open-ended in design and don't have fixed timelines. Next slide, please. Though within Fit for Food 2030, we of course were working in the context of a project, and we had to set a couple of rules for these policy labs. And we wanted to try to make sure that there was a certain ownership of the policy labs by the governments which took part within the project, and that it was embedded within the system, the R&I system of the country or the region, to have a higher likeliness for valorization and continuation after the end of Fit for Food 2030. For example, we worked on support and ownership by commitments, asking commitment letters of 2 ministries. The human resources had to come from the ministries or the government, and there should be a national interest and motivation to run a policy lab. And if you look to the incentive, what did we offer the policy labs? We offered them training and support. We offered them access to the Fit for Food 2030 products, also when they were drafting, a close access to what was happening at the EC level, and exchange with the other policy labs, as well as exchange with the think tank and the city labs. Next slide, please. During the course of the project, 11 policy labs, of which 9 national and 2 regional labs have been established, 7 just after the start of the project, end of 2017, and 4 more later around the start of 2019. Next slide, please. For the purpose of Fit for Food 2030, the policy labs are R&I Policy Labs that work at the national or sometimes the regional level to increase the impact of R&I on making the food system future-proof. And together with Peter Wagner from the Austrian Institute of Technology, we adapted the policy lab principles towards this context. And the policy labs had to build a network of diverse stakeholders, including unusual suspects. And together with these stakeholders, they worked on mapping the R&I system and the current food system, defined barriers and opportunities and knowledge gaps, and worked towards making the R&I landscape more coherent and fit for purpose towards innovation. The central aspects of the policy labs were a holistic food system approach and responsible research and innovation. And with an holistic approach, we mean to take into account the food system as a whole, with all its diverse aspects, such as agriculture and food processing, but also logistics, nutrition, and food waste. This means that the stakeholders involved had to come from all these different parts of the food system, but also that we wanted to have different roles of these stakeholders. Think about policymakers, scientists, people that work in industry, but also the farmer, the consumer, the end users. This systemic approach and the involvement of different stakeholders is a key aspect of the idea behind responsible research and innovation, which aims to make research better equipped to impact societal issues and to have a strong support base in society. Next slide, please. This slide shows a definition of policy coherence following the OECD. And in order to achieve policy coherence, it's important to align different policy objectives, which is a difficult challenge on its own. But even if you have reached this alignment or a certain level of alignment, it's still the question if policies are the right policies to the objective, but also if they are implemented in the right way. Next slide, please. And for this, the organizational alignment model from Tosti and Jackson is of interest. The idea behind this model is that, like in all systems, an organization functions best if all components work together in a smooth and efficient way. This implies that any changes that are made to the organization should be aligned within the existing system, or the system must be modified to accept the change. The model provides insight of the interaction between many elements of the complexity of an organization, and especially it shows the interrelation between strategy and goals, and values, practices, and individual behavior. And the latter is also of interest when looking at the policy labs to find leverage points and opportunities for experimentation and innovation, or in a broader context to understand the value of building a network that supports innovation and transformation, because you touch upon sharing the values, the practices, and the behaviors alongside with aligning the strategies. Next slide, please. Before we move to the various stages of the policy lab, where Chrissie will dive into with you, I will provide you with a summary of the challenges the lab are facing still today. You will see them listed here. One of the main challenges is to maintain and broaden the political support that the labs received when they started. This is especially a difficulty when the environment changes, like elections or changing in the hierarchy of the policy lab coordinators. But also the COVID-19 pandemic has been obviously a challenge. Building a network and trust is time consuming, especially in the case where stakeholders have to grasp both the R&I system as well as the food system, and to have a shared common understanding of both. The foreseen timeline, especially for the second group, was rather short, but also for the first group, to bring in certain stakeholders that are far away from the practice of the coordinators, we see that especially in the last months of the project, progress has been made. So this seems to take time. In the last year, of course, COVID-19 has been a challenge and had impact. It had impact on the policy labs process, like the organization of meetings or our trainings. But it is also a threat in relation to the attention and resources for the policy labs and the food system as a whole. On the other hand, we have seen opportunities because COVID is closely connected to the food system and diet, and is another emphasis of the need for change. So my last slide shows you the achievements of the policy lab. So despite the challenges, they have had shown great achievements, and we are convinced that the instrument should be further developed and used more often in the context of increasing impact in R&I. The word cloud shows you some insights in the achievements, and Chrissie will go more in depth on these. But just to list a few, the building of a network and trust, working towards alignment and shared views have been appreciated as an added value. Capacity building to foster dialogue between such a diverse group of stakeholders and the different interests and perspectives of those stakeholders. The opportunities for synergies and the improvement of procedures, but also more concrete outputs can be mentioned, like novel ways of funding research and having dedicated goals on the food system perspective. And herewith, I give the floor to Chrissie.
Thank you very much, Jolien, for setting that up. Yeah, so please don't forget to put any comments or questions you have in the chat. Hopefully we can get back to those. So what actually did the Policy Labs have to do which led them to these challenges and achievements? So what you see here is a graph we've been using a lot. It's the honeycomb. And so this is really the general structure of the Policy Lab process. And what you see here in the blue is kind of the overall process that they went through the different phases. Then the bright green is really the themes that the Policy Labs addressed with their stakeholders, so kind of like the themes of the stakeholder meetings. And then in the dark green, you see the training sessions that we offered them. I'm going to go into those phases, those bright green ones, in the rest of my presentation, but it's good to mention here that the structure is necessarily quite abstract and it's really a general outline because the local contexts and the starting points are very different. So for each lab, there's really a high degree of figuring out their own path and being responsive and adaptive to what happens along the way. You can't have a blueprint, which is both a bit of a blessing and a curse sometimes. Next slide, please. So here we go into the first phase, which is system awareness and analysis. So really, as Jolien just said, the understanding of the food system, what are the main challenges and the knowledge questions in your context of the region or the country, but also start mapping the existing related research agendas, research programs, policies, so that you have an overview of these, and keep asking, are we complete? Do we miss any relevant stakeholders? Who should be at the table for this conversation, for this exercise? Next slide, please. So when they started organizing their first meetings, they had to move from theory to practice. Building their stakeholder network was really the first step. They mostly started with their own network, logically, and the network of their own organization, and often they kind of snowballed from there. So when they had stakeholders, asked them, who else do you think we need to invite? Some deliberately started with a small group of stakeholders, others started with casting the net very wide. This could also depend on whether they could link to another event or an initiative of a specific stakeholder group. And in these first meetings of where they did this analysis, the identified strengths actually varied a lot. You can see some of them here. And we think this is really illustrative of the fact that all these contexts and starting points are so different. So that's why you really need to account for that. There are, perhaps not unsurprising, more commonalities in the weaknesses and challenges, such as, well, you see them there. Lack of sustainable circular production, food waste, diet-related diseases, lack of cooperation, and low involvement of consumers. Next slide, please. Here you see just a brief example of some kind of the participants that joined one of the first lab meetings. This is a matrix that we asked them to fill in after the meeting, just to give you an impression. A bit of reflection here. So during this process, all labs really made good progress on the stakeholders that they connected with since the start, but there is still potential to make the stakeholder groups more diverse. So also looking towards the future, stakeholder engagement and management, it's a really important topic and it could be further developed, especially of certain groups of stakeholders such as citizens, healthcare and industry. And maybe also some of those more out-of-the-box actors, such as lawyers, economists, behavioral psychologists, that can bring a different perspective to the table on these issues. And when it comes to who's involved in the lab, having sufficient and preferably growing political support is really key for the impact of the policy lab. But as was already said, this can be difficult and it's not always something the coordinators of the lab can influence and definitely don't have any control over. Next slide, please. So here we come to the second phase, which is really about developing collective visions of the future food system and starting to draft roadmaps or also pathways to change, we call them. So that's really about making an analysis of both the food system and the R&I and see where do we want to go and what do we need from policy and from R&I in this specific context of Fit for Food. Next slide, please. And I know you can't read this, but this is also just to give you an idea what came out of this visioning process and this mapping and this working on pathways. So this is from the Hungarian Policy Lab. This was their vision that they made together. And then on the next slide, you see here R&I factors that hinder or support the vision of the lab. And just to name a few of these, we have removing barriers for open science, collaboration between social and life sciences, citizens having a say in what research can impact their lives, and fostering faster market access. But there's many more, and of course we have this available if you have interest in this. Next slide, please. If you could all switch back to your Mentimeter, we have another question. So having just looked at this thing from the Hungarian Policy Lab, this overview, what barriers or opportunities for the R&I system do you see in your context? So what do you think could be a real improvement for the R&I system to make it have more impact, make it more responsive? And what do you think is a current barrier? Well, we'd be really interested to get your take on that as well. So I can imagine you might have to have a little think about this, and maybe also the rest of the presentation will give you some inspiration. So I suggest we move on. But please also in the other screen, keep your Menti open, and we'd be really happy to have some of your suggestions there. And if we can go back to the presentation and have the next slide. Okay, so in the third phase, the lab's focused on experimentation and innovation. So if and how they can put some of these opportunities that they've identified, or these pathways to impact, into practice. And the idea here is to really help the labs move from talking to doing. So it's easy to sit around the table and talk about stuff, but you have to move to action to get change done. You can think of this as a pilot also. This can be about what is research, but also about how research is conducted and trying to solve barriers in the R&I system. And I think this is really key also, thinking about how can what we're going to do, this experiment or this concrete thing, have add to a sustainable change in food systems R&I. So some examples could be offering financial incentives for inter or transdisciplinary research, or looking at issues in the transfer of research outcomes to innovation, to the market. Talking about experiments, it's good to remember that these labs are very much an experiment in themselves of working in this way together. Next slide, please. So I want to dive a little bit deeper into some of the labs with you, just to give you an example or showcase of what's been done. So in Flanders, the intention of the coordinators from the start was to develop an integrated food systems research agenda. And they did this over the course of several larger meetings, but also bilateral meetings with stakeholders. So that's also a strategy. And it was built around a number of missions focusing on interdisciplinary topics that include circularity, digitization, and nutrition. And the research agenda is complementary to an integrated food policy, and actually bringing the different departments of the government and civil servants together for the policy lab was really instrumental in getting the Flemish food policy on the agenda of the government. And working in this way, making interministerial policy is really quite new in Flanders, as I think it actually is for many regions and countries. And in addition, it would also be quite new to have an integrated research program like this financed, because the emphasis is really very much in Flanders on bottom-up research-driven research. And so that makes it difficult to have a good connection between science and policy. So really going into the science policy interface there. Now, the second country here, Romania, they did it differently. They started with separate meetings with different groups of stakeholders, such as policymakers, industry, because they could connect to an industry event, for example. And this was a good strategy for them. The work they did focused on waste and circularity, because again, this fitted well with the Romanian context. And later on in the process, they did expand to having meetings with many different stakeholders, having larger meetings, and they were also able to broaden their political support thanks to finding the right allies. So that's also something to look at, who can be your ally, although we understand it also, requires some luck. And the Policy Lab has already fed into topic selection for national research programs and strategies. And there has been a consumer information campaign on food waste launched by the Ministry of Agriculture, which kind of came from the Policy Lab, and the development of an interministerial agreement on holistic food systems research is foreseen. So that's still planned for the future. A little bit of reflection here. So looking at these experiments and sort of outputs like agendas, it's really great to see that action has been achieved, in fact. But the question, of course, is what has the capacity of the Policy Lab so far been to really influence R&I policies and to improve policy coherence? This is very difficult. And when we talk to the lab coordinators about this, they say that there aren't many concrete examples that they can give about changes at the policy level. Although when you influence national strategies, that is of course also impact because they belong to that sort of network of policies that Jolien talked about. They all feel though that important first steps have been taken. By gathering the different policy actors and having these conversations, they have started working towards policy coherence. And the raised awareness is really an important condition to move forward. And several coordinators have told us that at the start of the lab, a lot of people said, what is the food system? What is the food system's approach? And that is not the case anymore. And people are coming towards them and finding them for information. Several further steps around interministerial collaborations and joint strategies are in development or are planned to take place. It's really just a very complex process. First of all, people need to wrap their head around the concepts, so of the food system and the R&I system, which is huge. And together they'd need to take a number of consecutive steps, and as well as getting to know each other and building trust, and this just takes time. Next slide, please. So where are we now? The project will finish at the end of December, and we're really now sort of coming out of this phase of wrapping up, taking stock, what are the lessons learned, what has been achieved, what has actually changed since the start of the lab, what is the future outlook, which opportunities do the coordinators see for continuation of the lab, or at least the topics of the lab and the stakeholder network. And as I just mentioned, some things are still in development or have been planned, such as Romania's interministerial agreement on food systems research, but for example, also a position paper about bridging the gap between funding more fundamental research and research with higher TRL levels between a Ministry of Agriculture and the Governmental Agency for Business. So that's still really exciting stuff on the horizon. Some opportunities that the labs see for continuing with the work with the lab or the network are so keeping part of the stakeholder network as a formalized mirror group to continue these discussions, and also connecting the policy lab to an existing initiative such as a national committee on agricultural research, for example, by forming a food systems subcommittee. And those of you who are familiar with the SCAR and the SCAR Food Systems Working Group, this model might seem familiar to, but you can also do something similar nationally or regionally, of course. And there's a very strong sense amongst the coordinators that what they've done and their experiences should feed into the ongoing European policy developments, such as the implementation of the Farm to Fork strategy, but also the development of the new partnership on food systems, and perhaps other parts of Horizon Europe. I saw one of the audience members mentioned the Green Deal. At the same time, on the other hand, national implementation of these strategies, of the Farm to Fork, of the partnership, can also offer opportunities for the continuation of the labs. Next slide, please. So just briefly to summarize the most important points. So we have here these outcomes and impacts, awareness, the networks, some concrete outcomes like dedicated calls and agendas, uptake in national strategies, but also this increased contact between ministries, but also between the different actors from different parts of the food system. So really this idea of a network. And then also the challenges, of course. And we also asked the coordinators about what was really to them the added value of the policy lab. And actually a nice one to mention is that some of them were a bit hesitant beforehand because some of the methods we used were maybe a bit creative, a bit new, a bit exciting. And they thought, well, I'm not quite sure how my participants, sort of like these important people high up in the hierarchy are going to respond to this. But the response was overall very positive. And here a quote, without Fit for Food and the Policy Lab, we would probably not have done or started this type of work. And these outcomes and impacts, we feel, have really laid the groundwork, great as they are in themselves, but they've already also really laid the groundwork for further improvements at the policy level of the food system and the R&I system. And in the end, it's really all about co-creation and changing mindsets of people. Next slide. So we have a final question to you in Mentimeter. Having heard all of this, do you see scope for a policy lab in your country or region? Do you think, yes, that's really interesting, we need to do something with that? Is it a resounding yes? Are you not quite sure yet? Or do you think, nah, that's not for us? Or I don't think that's going to be something we can do. I don't really believe in the use of it. Well, of course, we're very happy to see the majority of responses so far going to yes, and maybe not sure yet. We can understand you need a bit more information. There's a lot to tell in very little time. Of course, we have, from all the labs, we have the stories and the examples there. And if we can go back to the presentation. So if you're saying yes or you're not sure yet, well, what we have for you is a Policy Lab handbook that we developed, guiding you through all the steps and taking into account the experiences and tips and tricks from what we've done. Some other things that's maybe of interest to you is a guideline that's being developed currently about implementing R&I principles in the funding practice. So how can we, in the funding practice, really increase the impact of research on societal challenge by integrating these principles? And also the EU think tank has written a number of policy briefs, which we think are really quite concise and interesting for policymakers about how to innovate R&I, the R&I system in the context of the food system. And you can find those here. Last slide, please. Thank you. We're really happy that you decided to join us today. We hope that it was useful and interesting to you. And we have a little bit of time for some questions.
Yeah, I've listed 4 questions.
Wow.
I think some of them you touched upon during the presentation, but I think one important one is if the policy labs are vulnerable for industry who are looking for financial profit rather than climate change.
If it's of interest to industry to join into the
or that the policy labs, because the industry joins, maybe are very much influenced by the industry.
I mean, that's hard to say, I think, beforehand. Of course, you'd hope not. And the idea is really the structure of the policy lab really offers you the option of having all voices heard and really making it a co-creative process. And it's good, to hear the voice of the industry and what their point of view is on matters. And hopefully, if you think that that is the position that they take, that at the end of the day, money is their main, or profit is their main interest. The world is changing, and the way we are doing things at the moment is not tenable. So I think the industry has great interest to be at the table to talk about how to improve for the future.
Yes, and I think also in addition to that, the instruments, so how to bring those stakeholders together, are very much focused on making sure that also the unusual suspects or the less vocal stakeholders like consumers are heard, so that you make sure that there is a balanced way in how those voices are represented. Yeah. And another thing, what we feel why R&I is so important is that it is future looking. And not to the here and now. And because of the future-looking perspective of R&I, it has the opportunity to overcome some conflicts of interest that we have now, and to look to the vision in 10 or 20 years ahead, and how it will look then, have the shared vision, and then see which role can be played by the different actors. And this conflict of interest, industry is mentioned, but of course you also see that between ministries. Ministry of Health, Agriculture and Economics have different interests and reasons to fund research, and the idea is to bring all those views together and to get to this more coherent approach, and being very open also about the different needs and conflicts of interest.
Which can be a struggle, and I mean, at the end of the day, it is up to the people who are at the table if they are willing to show that openness. But we do think that this is a good way to facilitate that potentially. And also, what is interesting when we talk about this, with these conflicts of interest, the experience does kind of show that the topic of R&I, of research particularly, is quite a neutral arena for people with conflicting interests to speak. For example, different ministries, because you're not talking about changing thematic policies immediately. You're just talking about, okay, so what are the knowledge needs? What are the questions? And that kind of can be conducive for people to starting to talk to each other about these kind of topics.
Another question is around the amount of participants in each lab. Do we have a slide on that?
No, not in each lab. It differs. There were labs that kept it relatively small, so we're thinking about sort of around 30 participants but there were also labs that had meetings with 60 participants, and definitely much larger networks of people who were involved. Of course, the larger the group of people you have, you have to sort of really think about your meeting design also, and how you can sort of funnel all those different voices and opinions and make sure that everyone is heard.
And we are currently looking into the final report of the policy labs, which also includes counting the numbers of participants of each of the meeting that they have had. This is work in progress, but I believe we were around 1,000 participants of the labs in total, but very huge differences between the labs.
Yeah, but this data is coming in, so it will be available in a couple of, well, at the end of the project, which is nearly there. Then we have to have it. So yeah.
Another question: will the labs
is there anyone willing? You can also sort of turn on your mic and video if you would like to ask a question. And not sure if anyone would like to take the floor.
There was a question around if the labs remain active.
Yeah, good question. I think that's what I talked a little bit about in sort of these future outlook and the opportunities that they see. And again, it differs. In some countries, it seems like it might continue as a sort of mirror group and also connected to these implementation of the European development. So implementation of the farm to fork, there might be sort of a mirror group around that, how to implement that, keeping the stakeholder network alive. I mean, of course, already the funding for the staffing costs came from the ministries. That's not money from the project. So if they find it useful and successful enough, the countries or the ministries could choose to keep this going. But as of yet, it's not always entirely clear yet.
For example, the Irish Policy Lab still plans to have early next year a citizens panel to influence the priorities of their R&I agenda. The Italian Policy Lab is looking towards consulting consumers because they feel they missed out on that one in the previous meetings. They are doing that still within the project, but the results coming out of that will be processed into the material that they have made as of today, and will feed into future policies and agendas. So there is this ongoing work that certainly will not stop at the end of the project.
Yeah, indeed. It's very much okay. Does the lab sort of continue in this form? Is it going to be institutionalized, or is it also very much about the legacy of the lab, you know, about these conversations and these actions and developments that are continuing? So it just also depends on how you define continuation.
I think this were the questions. You also question about main outputs and main successes. I think we touched upon that quite extensively.
I mean, as we have a few more minutes, when you talk about outputs, I do have sort of a few smaller examples of what actually happened in the lab. So I gave sort of more these in-depth showcases, if you will, of Romania and Flanders. But for example, in the Netherlands, what they did was they launched a sandpit core. I'm not sure if everyone's familiar with that concept, but it means that you put, you don't really have a clearly defined outcome beforehand yet, but you put a whole bunch of researchers and other stakeholders. It's very transdisciplinary together in a room for, I think in this case, 4 days. Yeah. They went to a hotel somewhere.
It was before COVID.
Yes, yeah. in the good old days. And they were together in a hotel, and out of this came one large transdisciplinary consortium, and they wrote a project proposal which has recently been funded. So in the upcoming years, they're going to be looking at a lot of different aspects of transition of the food system in the Netherlands. So yeah, that looks really interesting and promising. We have more information about that. And in Ireland, for example, what has already happened, Ireland was in the second batch of labs, so they've been, delayed a bit also by the developments. But what has already happened is that the Ministry of Agriculture, Food and the Marine has just launched a new multi-year strategy. And there is a chapter in that on the food systems approach and the need for the food systems approach. And they do say, being a part of Fit for Food and having the lab has really helped to shape and structure that chapter and give input. So that's sort of all these different ways in which you see that there are impacts, outcomes, and we think successes.
Yes, so like a snowball that's rolling and that we hope continues to do that after the project ends. It might be also good to say that many of the labs are connected to international networks such as the SCAR Working Group of Food Systems, the FATSA JPI, JPI Oceans, or JPI HDHL. So there is also this connection towards the EU policies.
So thank you very much for joining us today. Again, hopefully it was useful, and please contact us for more information or go to those resources.